The sun hung low over the parched expanse of Redstone Valley, its amber rays casting long, wavering shadows that clung to the brittle sagebrush like ghosts reluctant to fade. A faint wind stirred, carrying fine grains of dust in a silent dance, brushing past a solitary figure standing beside a weathered wooden cross driven into the hard-packed earth. Amos Carver, a tall, wiry man, worn by years of toil and sorrow, stared at the grave without blinking. The wood, bleached by relentless sun and scoured by wind, bore the faint but legible inscription: Eliza Carver, beloved wife, 1825 to 1865. He brought no flowers. Eliza had never cared for them, preferring the stark beauty of the valley's unadorned wildness. Instead, Amos tilted his wide-brimmed hat, its edges frayed from years of wear, and bowed his head, his lips moving in a murmur that might have been a prayer or a fragment of memory, too soft to carry beyond the moment. The years since Eliza's passing had folded into a blur of grief and solitude. The war had claimed their son, Jacob, just 2 summers before, his life snuffed out in a distant battle. When the letter arrived, its words cold and final, Amos had folded it carefully and left it on the kitchen table, where it remained untouched, a silent monument to loss. His world had shrunk to the weathered walls of his ranch house, a creaking structure that seemed to sigh with every gust of wind. Silence became his language, his days unmarked by speech, even to himself. The only sounds were the scuff of his boots on worn floorboards, the groan of leather as he worked, and the rhythmic scrape of a shovel against earth, his sole companions. He lived on the edge of Sage Hollow, a small town nestled in the valley's curve, but it might as well have been 1,000 miles away. The townsfolk spoke of him in hushed tones, their words a mix of pity and suspicion. Still talks to ghosts, they whispered at the general store or on the church steps. That ranch is cursed with sorrow. No one ventured to his door unless necessity demanded it, and Amos ensured no such need arose, keeping his world tightly bound within the fence line of his land. He trudged the dusty path back to his house, each step pressing deep into the earth, as if anchoring him to a place that both sustained and confined him. The sun bled into the distant mesas, painting the valley in hues of molten copper and burnt orange, a fleeting beauty that seemed to mock the permanence of his grief. His home loomed ahead, its weathered boards slanting slightly, a few clay tiles missing from the roof, yet it stood resolute, like Amos himself, groaning under the wind's touch but unyielding. The porch creaked beneath his weight, the sound as familiar as his own heartbeat. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of aged wood and a stillness deeper than silence, a quiet that seemed to hold its breath. A single photograph adorned the house, Jacob, standing tall in his Union gray, his young eyes holding a fragile pride, a mix of duty and uncertainty. Amos passed it daily, his glance brief, just long enough to touch the memory, never long enough to drown in it. That evening, dark clouds rolled in from the west, low and brooding, their edges tinged with the threat of a storm. The wind picked up, its mournful song keening through the fields, whipping the porch curtains into a restless dance. Amos lit a single lantern, its weak glow casting flickering shadows across the room. He sat at the table, nursing a tin mug of bitter coffee, the taste sharp against his tongue. Rain hadn't yet fallen, but its scent, raw metallic, like iron freshly forged, hung heavy in the air, promising a deluge. Then came the knock. It wasn't timid or hesitant but firm, heavy, measured, like someone seeking to rouse a house that had slumbered too long. Amos froze, the mug halfway to his lips. No one knocked on his door, not in years. Another knock followed, firmer yet still calm, its rhythm suggesting patience rather than menace. He rose slowly, his hand drifting instinctively to the rifle hanging above the hearth. His fingers brushed the cool barrel, then paused. Whoever stood outside hadn't forced their way in. They knocked with purpose, perhaps reverence, not aggression. He opened the door, the hinges creaking softly. Twilight had swallowed the valley, painting the world in shades of indigo, with lightning flickering on the horizon like the ghost of a fire. There they stood, 7 Apache warriors, towering like figures from legend, broad-shouldered, draped in worn blankets that glistened with the first drops of rain. Their horses stood behind them, tethered in a line, pawing restlessly but disciplined, their breath visible in the cooling air. These men were giants, not just in stature but in presence, every movement imbued with a quiet weight, as if the earth itself shifted to accommodate them. The leader stepped forward, older than the rest, his long braid threaded with bone beads that clicked softly in the wind. His face, carved by decades of sun, wind, and war, held eyes deep and unreadable, locking with Amos's in a gaze that felt like it could pierce stone. "We seek shelter," he said in slow, careful English, his voice low and steady. "Until the storm passes." Amos stood silent, his hand hovering at his side, fingers twitching near his belt. The lantern's glow spilled across the man's face, casting long shadows that danced across the porch like spirits. The silence between them stretched, thick with something older than fear. History, perhaps, woven with blood, land, and unspoken debts. The Apache did not repeat himself, standing motionless, neither pleading nor threatening, simply waiting. Behind him, the others were statues, their presence a quiet force. Amos glanced past them to the horizon, where the storm gathered strength, its dark clouds roiling like a living thing. He knew the smell of thunder as he knew the ache of loss. It would be a hard storm, merciless. He exhaled sharply through his nose and stepped aside. "Stable the horses in the barn," he said, his voice rough but steady. "Hay and water's there." The leader nodded once, a deep, deliberate gesture that carried the weight of gratitude without words. The warriors moved, their motions fluid and silent, respectful as they led their horses to the barn. For years, Amos's house had been a hollow shell, filled only with wind and the faint glow of memory. But now it brimmed with life, quiet, massive men who smelled of earth, smoke, and rain. They spoke not a word, shedding their soaked blankets and settling near the hearth, where a small fire crackled. They warmed stiff limbs, their movements deliberate, as if mindful not to disturb the sanctity of the space. Amos poured more coffee, his weak supply dwindling faster than he'd planned. But a part of him, buried deep, where hope hadn't entirely died, didn't care. He handed a tin mug to the leader, who accepted it with a soft grunt of acknowledgement, the sound carrying more weight than a spoken thanks. Amos sat back at the table, the lantern's light flickering across unfamiliar faces. These were not the Apaches of saloon stories or soldiers' tales, painted as savages in dime novels. They carried themselves like carvings of stone, each motion precise, purposeful. One man drew a piece of deer hide from a pouch and began stitching a pattern, his fingers moving with the steady rhythm of a man accustomed to creating beauty from necessity. Another sat cross-legged, eyes closed, his breath slow and deep, as if listening to the fire's whispers. For the first hour, no one spoke. The only sounds were the crackle of the hearth, the distant rumble of thunder, and the soft patter of rain beginning to fall. Then, a young warrior, barely more than a boy, glanced at the photograph on the mantel, Jacob's face, frozen in time, his Union gray faded but proud. The boy pointed, his voice halting in English. "Your son." Amos nodded, his throat tight. "Gone?" the boy asked, his eyes soft with something like understanding. Amos nodded again, the motion mechanical. "War took him." The boy lowered his gaze, then reached into a pouch at his belt, withdrawing a small object. A stone carved into the shape of a hawk, smooth and rounded, no larger than a walnut. He placed it gently on the table before Amos and said nothing, returning to his place by the fire. Amos stared at the stone, its curves catching the firelight, then at the boy, then back to the flames. Outside, the wind screamed, and the rain began to lash the windows. Around midnight, a cough broke the quiet. It came from a young warrior, tall with hollow eyes, who turned away, muffling the sound with his hand. Amos caught a glimpse of red between his fingers. Blood, not much, but enough to stir a familiar dread. No one reacted, not even the man himself, who wiped his hand on his blanket and returned to silence. Amos told himself it wasn't his business, but his gut clenched, the same ache he'd felt when Jacob returned from a patrol, pale and trembling. A sickness they hadn't understood until it was too late. He rose, stoked the stove, and set about making a weak broth from what he had: old potatoes, a sliver of onion, a bit of marrow scraped from a bone. He ladled it into a tin cup and handed it to the warrior without ceremony. The man accepted it with a nod, sipping slowly, his eyes meeting Amos's for a brief moment, conveying something unspoken: gratitude, perhaps, or recognition of a shared humanity. The night wore on like a solemn hymn, thunder rolling in the distance, the house creaking but holding fast. Amos sat in his kitchen, surrounded by men his neighbors would call enemies, yet who now shared the only space he'd ever deemed holy. The fire cast long shadows, and the rain beat a steady rhythm against the roof. At dawn, Amos stepped onto the porch, the air crisp and wet, carrying the clean scent of a world washed anew. Patches of pale blue sky peeked through retreating clouds. The leader joined him, standing silently as they watched the horizon brighten. "I am Cale," he said at last, his voice low, resonant. Amos nodded. "Amos Carver." Cale's gaze swept the valley, its red rock cliffs glowing faintly in the morning light. "You are alone." It wasn't a question. "I was," Amos replied, the words carrying more truth than he'd expected. Cale looked out again, his braids swaying slightly in the breeze. "Storms strike fast here." Amos glanced at him sidelong. "And linger longer than you'd wish." They stood together, breathing the same morning air, the land stretching before them like a scar that had begun to heal. Inside, the warriors slept, the fire reduced to glowing embers. Cale spoke again. "We leave when the sun is high." Amos nodded, saying nothing. Cale gave one final look toward the open plains, then slipped back inside, silent as a shadow. Amos remained on the porch, his mug warm in his hands. The damp would cool beneath his boots. For the first time in years, his land felt less like a prison and more like a place waiting to be lived in again. The hawk-shaped stones sat on the table inside, a quiet reminder of the night's grace, and the storm had finally passed. Morning unfolded slowly over Carver's ranch, sunlight spilling gold across the damp earth, catching on beads of dew that clung to every blade of grass. The storm had scoured the sky clean, leaving behind a hush that felt sacred, as if the valley itself held its breath in reverence. Inside, the fire's last embers glowed, casting soft light across the sleeping warriors' faces. Amos moved with quiet purpose, pouring water from a chipped pitcher into a dented tin basin to wash his face. The cold bit at his skin, pulling him into wakefulness. His eyes flicked to the back room where the warriors rested, their blankets neatly folded, their presence filling the house with a warmth it hadn't known in years. The air was thick with the sense of smoke, damp wool, and unfamiliar men. Not uncomfortable, just different, like a house stretching to accommodate more souls than it was used to. The warriors stirred as sunlight crept across the floorboards. Cale rose first, his movements slow but purposeful, each gesture weighted with meaning. He didn't speak, didn't need to. One by one, the others followed, stretching limbs, blinking at the sunlit windows, gathering their belongings with a quiet reverence, as if the house itself were a sacred space. Amos cooked a pot of oats over the stove, adding a pinch of salt and a trace of molasses, one of his few remaining luxuries. He set the pot on the table with clean tin bowls, the clink of metal the only sound breaking the morning's calm. The warriors ate in silence, save for the occasional low word in a language Amos didn't know but found beautiful, its cadence flowing like the creek that ran near the valley's ridge, low, steady, untroubled by time. After the meal, Cale led the others to the barn to tend their horses. Amos watched through the kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, as they moved as one, like wolves in harmony. Their horses, tall, muscled creatures with thick manes, responded to the slightest tug or whisper, their bond with the warriors deeper than anything Amos had seen. He'd once broken horses for a Confederate captain, teaching them to obey bit and spur. But this was different. A quiet, unspoken connection, as if man and beast shared a single pulse. The morning passed in this rhythm of quiet purpose, the valley waking slowly under a sky scrubbed clean by the storm. Near noon, a sharp knock shattered the calm. Not the patient knock of the night before, but impatient, edged with authority. Amos opened the door to find Deputy Will Tate astride a bay mare, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. Tate's eyes squinted against the sun but narrowed further when they met Amos's, searching for something to condemn. "Got company, Carver?" he asked, his voice tight as he scanned the yard, taking in the faint hoofprints in the damp earth. "Heard there was smoke here last night. Lights in your windows." Amos didn't flinch, his face as unyielding as the valley's cliffs. "Storm came through. Figured you'd be mending your own fences, not chasing chimney smoke." Tate's gaze shifted, catching the edge of a woven blanket drying on the porch rail, its intricate patterns stark against the weathered wood. His fingers twitched near his holster. "You hiding Apaches out here?" Amos's silence was heavy as iron, a confession in its weight. Tate spat into the dust, the gesture sharp with disdain. "You're courting trouble, Amos. You know what folks think of them." Amos's jaw tightened, a muscle flickering beneath the weathered skin. "I don't care what folks think. They knocked." I answered. Tate leaned forward in his saddle, his voice low, almost a growl. "You don't owe them a thing. They've taken enough from men like you." Amos met his eyes, slow and measured, his voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. "You ever lost a wife, Will?" Tate blinked, thrown off balance, his hand pausing above his revolver. "What's that got to do with it?" "Then don't tell me what I owe or to whom." Tate sat there a moment longer, caught in the quiet fury of the man before him. Finally, he grunted, tugged the reins and turned his horse. "Town won't like this, Carver. You'd best think on that." The hoofbeats faded into the distance, and Amos's voice was soft but firm. "I have." He closed the door gently, the wood settling with a soft thud. Behind him, the young warrior who'd left the Hawk Stone stood watching, his dark eyes steady. He nodded once, a silent acknowledgement, then returned to his task. The afternoon passed in quiet labor. Amos took to the barn, patching a broken slat in the fence with the help of two warriors. They spoke little English, but work needed no language, gestures, a hammer passed, a nod of approval sufficed. The task was simple, yet it felt like a bridge, a shared rhythm that bound them in the moment. Inside, the house had transformed. Where once there had been a stillness akin to death, there was now motion, life. One warrior swept the hearth, his movements careful, as if honoring the space. Another sharpened a knife, the blade's edge catching the light, his hands mindful not to mar the wooden floor. The sick youth, Kui, sat by the window, a blanket draped over his shoulders, his breath coming easier today. Amos had placed a tin cup of willow bark tea beside him earlier, its faint herbal scent mingling with the air. Kui had nodded once in thanks, his eyes holding a quiet gratitude. As dusk settled over the valley, Cale joined Amos by the pasture, the two standing side by side, surveying the land in silence. The red cliffs glowed faintly in the fading light, their edges softened by the coming night. Cale spoke, his voice low, deliberate. "You lost your son." Amos didn't look at him, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I did." Cale's tone was steady, weighted with understanding. "War took him." "Kentucky," Amos said, the word heavy with finality. "Never came back." Cale nodded, not out of courtesy but in kinship, a shared recognition of loss's universal language. "We all lose sons," he said. "To war, to whiskey, to the land. The land's the only one that doesn't lie." Amos turned then, studying the older man's face, its lines like a map of endurance. "Why my house?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Cale's eyes held steady, unyielding. "Others have softer hearts, but none know ghosts like you." Amos didn't know whether to bristle or find comfort in the words. He settled for neither, letting them sit in the air like dust settling after a storm. "I didn't mean to keep him here," he said softly, almost to himself. "But I can't let him go." Cale's voice was gentle, like the creek's murmur. "You don't. You let him walk beside you, not lead." That night, Amos set out his last loaf of bread, a small portion of jerked beef, and the remaining potatoes, boiled with a pinch of salt. They ate together around the table, the fire casting a warm glow across their faces. No one asked for more, no one looked wanting. They ate like men accustomed to hunger, their gratitude expressed in the quiet of their eyes, not their voices. Afterward, as the fire burned low, a warrior with a jagged scar down his right cheek began to hum, a low, steady sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Another joined, then another, until the room vibrated with a sound that wasn't melody but memory, a pulse older than time. Amos closed his eyes, and for a moment, he could almost hear Eliza's footsteps in the kitchen, soft and familiar, or Jacob's laugh echoing from the yard. When he opened his eyes, the warriors sat still again, hands resting on their knees, eyes closed, as if in communion with something unseen. Amos found himself breathing slower, deeper, a knot within him loosening, its release as quiet as the night. Later, after the others had turned in, Amos stood by the doorway to Jacob's old room. It hadn't changed in the years since his son's departure. The bed still made, a single boot beneath it, an unfinished carving of a sparrow on the shelf, its wings half-formed. He left the door open that night, the act feeling like a surrender, not to loss but to memory's persistence. The next morning, the wind shifted, blowing cold from Sage Hollow, carrying the scent of judgment. A rider arrived near noon, her chestnut mare kicking up dust. Reverend Caleb Holt dismounted, his robes dusty, his eyes heavy with worry. He greeted Amos with a soft smile, the kind worn by a man bearing news he'd rather not deliver. "I brought flour," he said, holding up a small sack. "And a warning." Amos poured coffee, and they sat on the porch, the warriors keeping to the barn. "Town's stirring," Caleb said, his voice gentle but firm. "Word's out about your guests. They don't like it, Amos. They don't understand." Amos shrugged, his eyes on the horizon. "I didn't ask them to." Caleb stirred his coffee, the spoon clinking softly. "They think it's dangerous, that you've changed." Amos met his gaze, unflinching. "Maybe I have." Caleb nodded slowly, sipping his coffee. "That's what scares them most." He stood, his shadow long across the porch. "They'll send someone again, not to talk." Amos nodded. "Let them." That night, the mood in the house was different, tighter. The warriors moved with care, their senses sharp, eyes alert. Even Cale seemed heavier, his presence more grounded, as if bracing for what was to come. Amos sat alone for a while, holding Jacob's photograph, his thumb tracing the frame's worn edge. He remembered his son laughing in the wheat field, falling asleep on Eliza's lap, promising, "I'll be back, Pa," before riding east. He hadn't known it would be the last time. Now he watched Kui, the young warrior, cough softly into his blanket, watched the others sharpen knives that might soon find flesh, watched the firelight dance on faces that didn't belong in Sage Hollow's narrow world but fit here, in his home, better than any townsfolk ever had. The silence returned, but it wasn't the hollow quiet of his years alone. It had weight, purpose, and in it, Amos found something he hadn't known he'd lost, belonging. Just before sleep, he heard a warrior speaking softly in his native tongue, the words unfamiliar but their shape comforting, like the sound of home. By the third day, Sage Hollow buzzed with rumors, the whispers growing into open talk at the blacksmith's forge, the feed store, the church steps. 7 Apaches at Carver's place. Armed, no doubt, plotting trouble, while Tate sat in the saloon, nursing a whiskey he hadn't paid for, his fingers restless on the handle of his 6-shooter. He muttered about Amos's betrayal, about the danger of harboring savages. No one told him to calm down. In Sage Hollow, hate often cloaked itself in the guise of law and order, and as deputy, Tate had enough rope to do harm if he called it duty. At the ranch, Amos stood in the barn doorway, arms crossed, watching Cale and his men repair a broken wagon axle with nothing more than a hatchet, rope, and patience. They moved with the grace of river stones, each fitting into the next, their work a silent symphony of efficiency born from years of living close to necessity. Qui, the boy who'd coughed blood, was improving, his fever broken the previous night. Amos had tended him with cool rags and broth, his hands steady despite the memories they stirred. When Qui opened his eyes and saw Amos sitting beside him, something passed between them. Gratitude, perhaps, or an understanding that needed no words. Later, inside the house, Cale joined Amos by the fireplace, sitting without ceremony, his tall frame folding beside the older man as if it belonged there. The quiet stretched between them, companionable now. "My people won't stay long," Cale said. "Only until Qui can ride." Amos nodded, setting a mug of hot water with mint leaves near Cale's hand. "You're welcome till then." Cale studied the rising steam, his eyes thoughtful. "You speak few words, but they carry weight. The young ones could learn from that." Amos gave a small nod, his lips twitching. "I've spent too many years shouting at ghosts." Cale's mouth curved, not quite a smile. "Do they listen?" "Not often," Amos said. "But they quiet down when you stop." They sat with that for a while, the fire crackling, the walls breathing, the prairie outside swaying like a sleeping beast. The calm shattered the next morning when hoofs thundered over the hills. Amos stepped onto the porch, rifle slung casually over his shoulder, his eyes sharp as flint. Tate rode in with 3 men, their rifles bared, their faces hard with cold judgment. "We're here peaceful," Tate said, though his grip on the reins suggested otherwise. Amos waited, silent. Tate's eyes swept the property, lingering on the barn. "Town sent us to check. Make sure everything's proper." Amos's voice was low, cutting. "You mean white?" Tate flushed, his hand twitching. "Don't twist it. We're ensuring you ain't harboring fugitives. Could be they were in that raid near Black Mesa last spring." "They haven't drawn a weapon," Amos said. "Asked for nothing but shelter." Tate tilted his head, his voice sharp. "They ain't citizens, Amos. They don't get to ask." Behind Amos, the door creaked, and Cale stepped out, his expression unreadable, his presence towering. Tate's hand slid toward his hip. "You sure about this, Carver?" Amos didn't move. "Never been surer." Tate looked to his men, gauging their resolve. One shifted in his saddle, another swallowed hard. "Reckon we'll be back," Tate said finally. "With papers. Official ones." Amos's voice was steel. "Bring what you want. Harm won't leave with you." The standoff dissolved without a shot, but it left dust in the air and a bitter taste in the throat. That evening, Cale spoke to his men in their tongue, the cadence steady but the tone braced. "Ready." Amos stood at the room's edge, watching. When Cale finished, Amos asked quietly, "Leaving soon?" Cale nodded. 2 days at first light. Amos stared at the floor. "They'll come again, worse than Tate." Cale placed a hand briefly on his shoulder. "We don't fear death, but we won't bring it to your door." Amos met his eyes. "I don't fear it either, but I won't send good men to it just because I'm stubborn." The words settled like dust on the windowsill, quiet but permanent. That night, sleep came fitfully. Amos dreamed of Jacob, not as a boy or in uniform, but standing at the fence line, hands in his pockets, watching the sunrise. He didn't speak, just smiled, his face bright with the promise of youth. Amos woke with tears crusted at the corners of his eyes, the dream lingering like a half-remembered song. The next day passed like the last breath before a storm. Still, tense, too quiet. The warriors gathered their belongings, Qui, pale but standing, helping roll a bedroll with shaking hands. Amos handed him a tin canteen and a small fold of cloth, its edges frayed but soft. "What's this?" Qui asked, his voice weak but curious. Amos looked him in the eye. "Eliza made it. Said it kept Jacob safe when he traveled." Qui clutched it like it was gold, his fingers trembling with the weight of the gift. Just after dusk, Reverend Caleb Holt returned, alone, his saddlebag swinging, hat in hand. "I came to warn you," he said, stepping into the kitchen. Amos nodded, waiting. "They're planning something for tomorrow night. Not Tate, others. Town's in a mood. They won't wait for warrants or deputies." Amos's face remained still, but a shadow passed behind his eyes. "How many?" "Enough to make fire," Caleb said, his voice heavy. "Enough to make ashes." Amos glanced toward the back room where Qui rested. "They'll need more than fire to drive us out." Caleb placed a worn Bible on the table, its leather cover cracked with age. "I don't want to see this place burned. Not after what it took to keep it standing." Amos looked at the book, then at the man. "Neither do I. But I won't beg a mob for mercy." Caleb nodded slowly. "Then I'll be here too." That night, as the warriors packed their things and laid down for a final sleep, Amos stood on the porch, listening to the wind. It had turned colder, spiteful, carrying the scent of trouble from Sage Hollow. Cale joined him, his presence steady. "You could send us away tonight," he said. Amos shook his head. "If they come with hate, it won't stop at the barn. It never does." Cale looked into the dark, his eyes reflecting the faint starlight. "Then we will meet it with truth." Inside, the fire burned low, warming the bones. Amos sat by it, Eliza's shawl draped over his lap, his fingers rubbing its edge, remembering the scent of her lavender soap, the hum of her voice in the garden. He didn't pray, but he spoke aloud into the room. "If you're still here," he whispered, "watch over them. They didn't ask for this." From the shadows, Caleb's voice answered, soft but firm. "God hears, even when we're not speaking to him." Amos didn't look up. "I'm not sure he's listening." Caleb sat across from him. "Then we'll speak loud enough he can't ignore." Outside, a coyote called, its cry high and lonesome. Somewhere beyond the ridge, men gathered in silence, rifles wrapped in cloth, torches ready to be lit. In the house built from grief, 7 warriors and 1 widower waited for morning, armed with no armor, no orders, just a memory, a promise, and a quiet defiance. Dawn broke with no birdsong, no breeze, just a heavy silence pressing against the windows of Carver's ranch. A tension that lived in the marrow, felt more than seen. The warriors rose before the light touched the floorboards, gathering their belongings with silent efficiency. Their faces bore the weight of men who slept with one ear open, one eye on the dark. They said little, but their shared glances carried a mutual understanding, a readiness for what might come, cloaked in flame and lead. What they hadn't expected was that it would unfold under a white man's roof, with a white man standing at their side. Amos sat at the kitchen table, boots laced, rifle across his knees. He stared out the window, watching the pale horizon unfold inch by inch. His heart beat slow and steady, as it had the night before his first cattle drive, as it had the day he buried Jacob. There was fear, but not for himself. He hadn't valued his own life in years. But Qui, the young warrior, still coughed in the back room, his frame frail, not strong enough to run. If they came with fire tonight, he wouldn't outrun the smoke. Cale stood in the doorway, backlit by the dull gray morning, his figure like a stone carving, unmoved by time. But Amos saw the heaviness in his eyes, the weight of battles fought with bullets and with silence. This fight, though small in numbers, was no less perilous. It wasn't just about survival, it was about being remembered rightly. "They'll come after dark," Amos said, his voice low. Cale nodded. "Always after dark. Always with fire." Amos's fingers tightened on the rifle. "I've got some oil left. 2 lanterns. A scattergun. Not much." Cale's voice was steady. "It's enough. Truth needs only to stand, not shout." Amos almost smiled, a rare flicker of warmth. He'd spent years shouting at closed graves, closed hearts. In these last days, he'd learned that standing in truth was louder than any noise he'd ever made. Reverend Caleb arrived just after noon, on foot this time, his mare having spooked and thrown a shoe near the bend. He carried his Bible under one arm and a long hunting rifle slung across his back, his face pale but resolute. He shook Amos's hand at the gate, not as a preacher to a sinner, but as a man to a man. Towns closed its eyes, Caleb said. They know what's coming, but no one will stop it. Amos murmured, they never do. Inside, the warriors prepared the house, moving furniture to block windows, shifting the firewood pile for cover. Qui was carried gently to the root cellar, a quilt wrapped around his thin frame, a lantern left beside his pale face. He protested weakly, but Cale knelt beside him, his voice firm yet kind. This is not cowardice. It is survival. You must tell the story if we do not rise again. Amos watched. A tightness in his chest he hadn't known still lingered. For a moment, Qui's face became Jacob's, a fleeting glimpse of the son who never came home. By nightfall, the sky turned a hard purple, streaked with red like a bruise on heaven's skin. The land was hushed, the wind stilled. Then the first torch appeared on the ridge, 1, then 2, then 5. They came on horseback, faces hidden behind bandanas and fear. Local boys, farmhands, sons of shopkeepers, raised on tales of savages and never taught to question the ending. They carried rifles, shotguns, and torches, their flames casting long, claw-like shadows on the dirt. Amos stood on the porch, Cale beside him, Caleb on the other side. None held weapons openly. They waited. The leader stopped 10 yards from the porch, his wide hat and long coat an attempt at authority, but his voice was brittle. We're here for the Apaches. Give them up and we walk away. Amos didn't move. They leave tomorrow. My choice. The leader's eyes narrowed. That ain't the town's decision. No, Amos said, his voice like iron. It's mine. A murmur passed through the men behind the leader. Doubt, perhaps, or the shock of resistance. You harbor enemies, Carver. You feed them, shelter them. Amos's gaze was steady. I gave them warmth. You bring fire. Remind me who the enemy is. For a moment the world held its breath. Then a torch was thrown, striking the barn's side, igniting the dry hay in a roar of flame. Horses screamed inside. Amos raised his rifle and fired once, not at a man but into the sky, a warning. The riders flinched. Cale gave a sharp whistle, and the warriors emerged from the house's shadows, bows drawn, knives flashing in the moonlight. They didn't shout or posture, their presence enough to freeze the mob. One rider panicked, raised his shotgun, and fired, splintering the porch rail. Amos dropped him with a single shot, the man tumbling from his horse, his torch dying in the dirt. Chaos erupted but was short-lived. The warriors moved swiftly, disarming one man, knocking another from his saddle, sending horses scattering. Caleb fired once, his aim true, extinguishing another torch. Within moments, the mob was reduced to confusion and fear. One cried out, "They lied," said he was crazy, wouldn't fight. Another dropped his rifle and fled. When it was over, 2 lay wounded, 1 unconscious. The rest scattered into the dark, their torches fallen like stars. The barn was half ablaze, but the warriors had freed the horses, and water from the well, passed in buckets, tamed the fire before it reached the house. Amos leaned against the porch post, breathing hard, his heart pounding. A bullet had grazed his shoulder, tearing fabric and skin, but sparing bone. Blood seeped into his shirt, warm and sharp. Cale stepped forward, wiping his blade, his eyes scanning the night. "They will not return," he said. Caleb exhaled, his voice trembling. "Lord, forgive us for what they believed, for what we nearly became." Amos sat on the porch steps, rifle across his lap, blood on his hand. "They never came for justice," he said. "Only for permission." Caleb nodded. "And we didn't give it." Inside, Qui stirred in the cellar, blinking against the lantern's dim light. Amos opened the door and looked down at him. "Did we win?" the boy whispered. Amos nodded. "You'll ride tomorrow." By morning, the riders were gone. The wounded were treated and sent back with warnings, not malice. Caleb stayed to help bury the fallen man under a juniper behind the barn, his name unspoken, not out of disrespect but because no one truly knew him. The warriors saddled their horses in silence, their movements fluid, purposeful. Cale approached Amos, holding a small object wrapped in deer hide. A carving of a wolf, its lines etched with care. "For you," he said, "to remind you that even broken wings remember the sky." Amos accepted it, words too small for the moment. Qui hugged him before mounting, his frame thin but his eyes brighter. "You kept me alive," he said. "You made it easy," Amos replied. The seven rode off at dawn, shadows against the sunrise. Amos stood at the fence line, the wolf carving warm in his palm, watching until they vanished. Caleb joined him, his voice soft. "Ever think you'd fight for strangers?" Amos paused. They weren't strangers. They just needed knowing. Caleb looked toward the road. "What now?" Amos wiped blood from his palm with his sleeve. "Fix the barn. Cut new posts. Maybe plant something." Caleb nodded. "Seems fitting." Amos agreed. "Maybe this time it'll grow." That night, Amos sat by the fire, the wolf carving in one hand, Eliza's shawl over his shoulders. He stared into the flames, not seeking visions or ghosts, but remembering what it meant to be alive, purposeful. He spoke to the silent air, the land that had borne witness. "I was wrong," he said softly. "Silence didn't keep me safe. It kept me alone." Outside, the wind stirred, gentle now. In the morning, he left the door open. Today, if you pass through Carver's ranch, you'll see 7 stones in a perfect circle beyond the porch. Not graves, but markers. A testament that silence can hold many voices, that healing can ride in on thunder, adorned with braids and feathers. Amos never remarried, but he lived his remaining years with windows open, the hearth warm, the fence mended. Some say he still speaks to Eliza. Some say he built a small cabin for travelers needing rest. Reverend Caleb, when asked, smiles and says a man is made whole not by the absence of pain but by the presence of understanding. So, if you carry ghosts, let them ride in. Let them sit by your fire. Let the silence break. For sometimes, salvation doesn't shout. It knocks and waits.